right, well, we might as well get underway. Good afternoon. For those of you I haven't met, my name is Kai Carmody, and I'm an associate professor here at Western's Faculty of Law. And since 2002, I've been the Canadian National Director of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute. The Institute was founded in 1976 as a joint creation of Western Law and the Case Western Reserve University School of Law in Cleveland, Ohio, to examine issues of relevance to the Canada-U.S. bilateral context. To that end, the Institute sponsors a number of activities each year, including the Canada-U.S. Law Institute Annual Conference, the 45th edition of which is taking place online April 23rd on the theme of climate change and the Arctic, profound disruption or uncertain impact. And that will have free admission for students, so please stay tuned for that. There is also publication of the Canada-U.S. Law Journal, which takes place once annually and is put together by a binational panel of students on both sides of the border, and periodic experts meetings and distinguished lectures such as this, as well as our ever popular student fora, the next two of which are going to be, first of all, on Tuesday, March 23rd at 6 p.m., focusing on negligence in law enforcement and the differences between Canadian and U.S. law regarding the duty of care in law enforcement. And secondly, on Wednesday, March 24th at 5 p.m., discussing the treatment of cases challenging lockdown orders in Canada and the U.S. So please join us for one or both of those. Details will be available shortly through the SLS Daily Bulletin. This, however, is the 14th annual Canada-U.S. Law Institute Distinguished Lecture, and this year our distinguished lecturer is Colin Robertson, who is Vice President of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute and a host of its regular Global Exchange podcast. Before assuming these positions, Colin worked as a diplomatic services officer with Canada's Department of Foreign Affairs, now Global Affairs Canada. And during his very varied foreign service career, he served as first head of the Advocacy Secretariat and minister at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, as Consul General of Canada in Los Angeles and Consul of Canada in Hong Kong, and in New York at our mission to the United Nations and the Consulate General there. Colin was also a member of the teams that negotiated the 1988 Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and the 1994 NAFTA. Colin now writes on foreign affairs for the Globe and Mail and is a frequent contributor to other media. And he'll be speaking today to us on the subject of working with the Biden administration, what we need to do. Now, before he does that, I would like to convey a few thank yous. So I'd like to, first of all, thank the Faculty of Law, particularly our Dean, Erica Chamberlain, for her continuing support of this lecture. I'd like to also thank Susanna Ayers, the faculty's communications officer, for liaising with Colin and helping to promote and publicize this event. And to Corey Meingarten, the faculty's systems administrator, who's ensuring a smooth broadcast and recording of the distinguished lecture today. I'd also like to thank students of this year's Canada-U.S. Law Institute Student Committee, particularly Victoria Ostrovsky, David Yun, and Cole Halbert, who have helped to coordinate and assist with this distinguished lecture. After Colin's distinguished lecture, there's going to be an opportunity for questions from the audience through Zoom. So if anyone would like to send along questions during the lecture or thereafter, this would be appreciated. So over to you, Colin.
Well, thank you very much, Kai, and my thanks to you and to Corey and Victoria for making this going, and especially to Corey, who I know is going to make sure that the slides and everything come through. Over the years, I've learned a lot from the work of your Binational Law Institute, especially when I've attended the sessions in Cleveland. I remember talking with the inimitable Henry King about the Nuremberg trials and with Sid Picker about trans-border environmental issues. As I say, it's an honor to speak at a forum that has also welcomed my friends, Larry Herman, Chris Sands, Janice Stein, Bruce Heyman, and the man from whom I probably learned the most about dealing with the United States, the late Alan Gottlieb. My remarks are going to come in three parts. First, a situational awareness of the Biden challenges, then mindful of the new roadmap for Canada-U.S. relations, some rules of the road on getting it done, And I'll conclude on a cautionary note because while diplomacy is inspired by idealism, it advances through pragmatism rooted in realism. I became familiar with the term situational awareness when I visited Pacific Command at Pearl Harbor when I was Consul General in Los Angeles. Hawaii was part of my parish. Situational awareness means being aware of one's surroundings and identifying potential threats and dangerous situations. It is more of a mindset than a hard skill, but it's as vital for diplomats as it is for the military. To understand how we can advance Canadian interests, we first need situational awareness of Mr. Biden's America. I begin say a prayer. Now let's see if we can, say a prayer for Mr. Biden. He faces the most formidable set of challenges for any president since Franklin Delano Roosevelt took power in 1932, when America was reeling under the Great Depression. In his inaugural address, Mr. Biden outlined the crisis facing America. First one, of course, is health. The pandemic death toll is awful, with over 500,000 dead. More Americans have died from COVID than died during America's 20th century wars. Biden is on track with his pledge of 100 million vaccinations in 100 days. In fact, there are in some cases 3 million vaccinations a day. He promises enough vaccines for everyone by the end of July. Then there's the economic malaise caused by the pandemic, but also technological change and globalization. Jobless claims remain well above the worst levels of the Great Recession. At 100% debt to GDP, US debt is higher than at any time in US history outside of World War II. By comparison, Canadian GDP debt is now about 50%, and in Ontario it's about the same. Americans, perhaps more than any other nation, believe that they were an exceptional people, living in what Ronald Reagan once called the city on the hill, a new world where if you work hard, you can succeed. But new polls tell us most Americans think their children will be worse off than themselves, for some reasons. The top 10% of Americans now own over 70% of the country's wealth. The top 1% controls more national income than the bottom 50%. Average income growth of the top 1% rose by 226% from 1979 to 2016, while working and middle class income distribution was comparatively flat. The economic turmoil continues to a larger social crisis complicated by race, gender, class, and culture. Racial injustice. The George Floyd trial is in today's news. But to give Black Lives Matter some wider context, if you're Black, you are twice as likely to die of COVID and 3 times more likely to be hospitalized. Black unemployment rates are double those of whites. Net worth for median Black households in the United States stands at $20,000 compared to $180,000 for whites. Then, of course, there's migration. The pressure on the southern border from those fleeing crime, corruption, and bad government, a movement that helped propel Trump to the White House on the promise of a wall to keep them out. Then, of course, there's climate, including biodiversity and pollution, rising temperatures and freak weather, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes, freezes and floods of biblical proportions. According to NASA, 2012 was the hottest year on record, followed by 2019 and then 2020. Biden must manage all these crises against a profound political divide that, like the social crisis, is compounded by race, religion, geography, and increasingly class. The political divide is visceral, as we witnessed in both the election, which saw a 67% turnout, the most since 1900, and in the impeachments. Despite the attack on the Capitol and Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell declaring Trump was morally responsible, only 7 Republican senators, not including McConnell, backed impeachment. The Republican Party is still the Trump Party, with half of Republicans believing that the election was, as Trump says, stolen. A switch of 50,000 votes in 3 states, and I'd be talking today about a second Trump administration. Republican and Democratic voters not only disagree over plans and policies, but they also disagree on basic facts. The political challenge for Biden is not only inter-party, but also intra-party, pitting the progressive wing, AOC, who you see right behind Joe Manchin, and the AOC faction includes Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, against the moderates, of course, Biden, Kamala Harris, Nancy Pelosi, and Chuck Schumer. As Will Rogers once remarked, I'm not a member of an organized party, I am a Democrat. Biden has set himself three overriding priorities: to revive and sustain the middle class, to fix the environment, and to restore American leadership of the free world. He and his team believe the well-being, economic, environment, health, social, is the best antidote to populism and the way to defend democracy. But it starts at home. As Biden put it, we have to put ourselves in a position of strength to be able to deal with the challenges we face around the world, from the great power competition with China to nuclear proliferation with Iran and North Korea. As to restoring America to global leadership, Biden recently told the Munich Security Conference, and you see here Angela Merkel watching this, quote, "We're at an inflection point between those who argue, given all the challenges we face, from the fourth industrial revolution to a global pandemic, that autocracy is the best way forward, and those who understand that democracy is essential to meeting those challenges." As for China, Biden says, quote, "We cannot and must not return to the reflexive opposition and rigid blocks of the Cold War. Competition must not lock out cooperation on issues that affect us all. For example, we must cooperate if we're going to defeat COVID-19 everywhere." By the midterms, which are just 2 years away, Biden needs the pandemic contained and the economy growing again, especially union jobs, and a visible reshoring of manufacturing to create jobs as well as resiliency. Biden's focus must be domestic, fixing things at home by using executive orders, legislation, as we're seeing right now with the major relief bill to build back better, and voting reform, immigration reform, and then regulation, especially on the environment and social justice. Internationally, he needs the allies to believe that America is back. So what does this all mean for Canada, and how do we get what we want done? We get it done through focus, continuous engagement, and whenever possible, rules-based institutions. Our relationship will always be asymmetrical, that polysyllabic word that actually means an awful lot. The US matters more to us than we matter to them. We level the playing field through a network of rules and agreements. At last count, well over 20,000, and institutions preferably binational, like NORAD, like the IJC, and like, of course, your own law institute. Most of our diplomacy is bilateral or multilateral, where we sit on opposite sides of the table. But binational means, at least in theory, that our representatives operate side by side, looking for the optimum results. It's the antithesis of Mr. Trump's winner take all. We are deeply, deeply integrated economically, a process that began before World War II and has continued despite bumps ever since, beginning with the Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, and now the new Canada-U.S.-Mexico Agreement. Some facts. 60 cents of every dollar we generate comes from trade. The US is our main trading partner, buying 75% of our exports. By comparison, the European Union takes about 8% and China 4%. The US provides over half of our imports and almost half of our foreign investment. The US also provides our security blanket. We became allies before World War II, negotiating defense production sharing agreements and then a binational alliance with NORAD in 1957 that now covers air and sea. We're also allied through NATO. We share the top half of our continent. The third, often forgotten, but increasingly important piece in our institutional architecture is our joint stewardship of the environment. The International Joint Commission, our oldest binational agency, has successfully managed our waterways for over a century, set up in 1909. These institutions represent a continuous process of continuous engagement. That's how we get it done. The roadmap, signed off last month by Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden, is but the latest iteration in neighborly relations that is both a model and envy for others. The 7 goals enumerated in the roadmap spell out our current shared objectives. Top of the list, of course, is COVID, combating COVID-19 at home and abroad. Building back better in sustainable fashion that also addresses new threats like cyber. Accelerating climate ambitions, starting with a common approach between Canada and the United States on things like carbon pricing, complementary standards, on emissions, sharing research and development and innovation. Advancing diversity and inclusion with a focus on the disadvantaged groups, women, visible minorities, and Indigenous peoples, in recognition that the rising tide of globalization did not lift all boats. Bolstering security and defense, including modernization of NORAD, especially its North Warning System. Building global alliances to address the threat of authoritarianism, but with burden sharing so the US doesn't pull all the load. This also means reform of rules-based order institutions like the World Trade Organization and the World Health Organization. To achieve progress on the roadmap, we need to stay focused and engaged because getting it done is always the hard part. Getting it done is a phrase another of my mentors, Derek Burney, who served as Brian Mulroney's chief of staff and then as our ambassador in Washington, would remind us of often as we strategized about high policy. Yes, situational awareness and a vision of strategy, tactics, and objectives is vital, but then we have to, as Derek would put it, get it done. Over my now 40+ years of working on Canada-U.S. relations, I've learned through trial and error some useful lessons, rules of the road for engaging the United States. They're complementary to and a companion to the 10 rules enunciated by Alan Gottlieb in his I'll Be With You in a Minute, Mr. Ambassador, The Education of a Canadian Diplomat in Washington. Gottlieb, of course, gave this first lecture. Still relevant, these 3 of his rules are especially current. 1. The particular process by which a decision is reached in Washington is often so complex and mysterious that it defies comprehension. 2. Since there are so many participants in decision making, so many special interest and pressure groups, and so many shifting alliances, a diplomat cannot design any grand or overarching strategy to further his nation's interests. Every issue requires its own micro-strategy, and every micro-strategy is unique. 3. No permanent solutions are within reach of the ambassador or his government, only temporary ones. Instability is the norm. Alliances and coalitions are always being forged, forces and counterforces are always mounting. I kept a copy of Gottlieb's book on my desk alongside the US Constitution during my time in Washington. That and subsequent experiences helped me draft my own 10 rules of the road for getting it done when dealing with Uncle Sam. And I'll start with them and I put them up. Get our collective act together because Americans will always exploit our differences. Know what is our ask and what is our give. Know our facts. Offer solutions, not whinging, and get to the point. Save the White House for what is really important. Second, Americans like big ideas. Be brief, be blunt, be bold. Go for gold. Ask for what we really want rather than what we think they will give us. If we don't take the initiative, then we take what is on offer. 3. Public diplomacy, and I would include here, of course, social media, is as important as closed-door diplomacy. We have, when we talk to Americans, 3 main messages. The first is really important. We have your back because national security trumps everything else when you deal with the United States. Second, we are a trusted trading partner making things together with our goods, services, and resources, fueling Build Back Better. And the third message, of course, as co-tenants of the environment, we are joint stewards of our land, water, and air. And these were the 3 that when I worked Capitol Hill and deal with Americans, I would always come back to, especially that first one, we have your back. When I first went to Washington, worked Capitol Hill, I felt like a Fuller Brush salesman. I'd go in, make my pitch, they'd like us, and I'd go. But I wasn't getting through. So after about 3 months, I had one of the officers in the Canadian Defense Liaison Group put on his uniform, come up with me. It made all the difference. keep in mind 25% of Americans who serve in Congress have done uniform service. That uniform, what that uniform represented and what the officer could talk about, most Canadians have served with Americans, they could underline the point, we have your back. Again, vital. These next two slides are banners we had made and we used to put on the embassy, still do, I think, on the first week of July, that of course covers July the 1st and July the 4th, underlining the point, friends, neighbors, allies, keeping in mind our embassy in Washington is on Pennsylvania Avenue, and as Kamala Harris now goes up to Capitol Hill regularly to vote, she passes the embassy on the way. And the second one, because we didn't go into Iran, which proved to be quite clever on Mr. Kretchan's part, but we were in Afghanistan, we got this poster made and we put it in the metro and judiciary and everything to underline that we were still America's allies. My fourth point, make it a US issue and identify US allies. There are always more Americans who think like Canadians than there are Canadians. Play by American rules, so use lobbyists and lawyers. Again, sometimes we think, oh, we shouldn't do this, but that's how it works in the States. The administration is our entry point, but the battleground is Congress, the states and cities. For legislators who must fundraise daily, and they've got to fundraise about $5,000 daily, all politics is local and all trade is local, so we have to make it local as well. And remember, in politics, if you're not on the offense, you're playing defense. 6, beware of noise. The American system is fundamentally different from ours with checks and balances and separation of powers. Most proposed legislation fails. Often I'll see in the papers in Canada, Congress introduces this or that bill. Keep in mind that only about 2% of what's introduced in the American Congress gets through, as opposed to our system where most that gets done comes through. Next point, protectionism is as American as apple pie and as old as the Republic. Frank McKenna, who is our ambassador, once said to me, when did the softwood lumber dispute start? I phoned up my friend who was the Librarian of Congress. He came back to me and said it goes to George Washington's second administration, when timber merchants in Massachusetts, which included Maine at that point, put up a tariff to keep out New Brunswick timber from being used in building ships. This next point is also important because I know we're doing it today and we shouldn't. Don't ask for an exemption, ask for reciprocal treatment. That's the art of the deal. We're not going to get exemptions. 8, Americans like us more than we like them. But business is business and the business of America is business. So don't ever expect gratitude for what we think we did for them. And this, the latest Gallup poll, when 94% of Americans like Canadians. The Brits are next, and this has been remarkably consistent for as long as Gallup has been doing polling. So keep that in mind when you talk to Americans. 9th point, we can disagree without being disagreeable. This is something that Brian Mulroney practiced extremely well. No surprises, especially in issues of national security. I saw this happen a couple of times around going into Iraq the second time, and around ballistic missile defense when we sent mixed signals. The one area the Americans hate surprises on are national security. My final rule of the road, it's a permanent campaign requiring engagement at every level, early and often. We need 1,000 points of contact, Prime Minister to President, premiers and governors, cabinets, legislators, mayors, business to business, labor to labor, and civil society, and it has to go on. Get this right, and we can not only advance Canadian objectives, but we can enhance our international standing. Brian Mulroney, the Prime Minister who best understands the United States, put it this way. There is a rule of global politics. Canada's influence in the world is measured to a significant degree by the extent to which we are perceived as having real influence in Washington. A cautionary note. In his 1862 address to Congress, while waging the Civil War, President Lincoln said, quote, in giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose our last best hope of earth. We want the United States to succeed. We want Joe Biden to succeed. We want a united and democratic America, just like we want a united democratic Canada. We all want to see a return to optimism and pragmatism, the can-do spirit that has been the enduring American characteristic and one that we all admire. We can do a great deal together, and with the rules of the road in mind, get it done. The US political scientist Ian Brenner recently observed the United States is a country of contradictions. It set the global standard on game-changing vaccines while leading the world in COVID deaths and hospitalizations. Its markets were at records high, while the Capitol building was stormed by violent insurrectionists. It flawlessly landed the new Mars mission while Texas suffered unprecedented power outages and no clean water. For all the innovation and growth, the politics of the United States are profoundly dysfunctional and getting worse. As Attorney General Garland Merrick said in his confirmation hearing, his priority is domestic terrorism. Whenever there's a crisis, pandemic response, the presidential election, or Texas energy debacle, the US shifts into the blame mode. That's not the city on the hill. Authoritarianism, whether monarchies, dictators, or oligarchies, not freedom and democracy, has been the prevailing system of government for most of recorded history. Once more, we have an authoritarian model, Xi Jinping's China, one where their economy has done better than any democracy each year for 30 years. As democracies turn inward, authoritarianism surges, contributing to the 15th consecutive year of decline in global freedom, according to Freedom House's just released annual assessment of political rights and civil liberties. Xi Jinping can claim his model preserves order while giving prosperity. Now he's exporting it abroad through the Belt and Road Initiative and through reinterpreting and revisiting the rules of international organizations. So I conclude by saying we've enjoyed what historian Margaret Macmillan describes as the long peace and the triumph of democracy, or what scholar Frank Fukuyama once called the end of history. But to quote that Nobel laureate Bob Dylan, the times they are a-changing. Study history and you realize that neither that long peace nor democracy is guaranteed. Study history and you know that the good guys don't always come first. While posted in New York City in the late 70s, I got to know the legendary BBC journalist Alistair Cooke. For half a century, he read listeners a weekly letter from America. Cooke told me, quote, "America is a country in which I see the most persistent idealism and the blandest of cynicism, and the race is on between its vitality and its decadence." So I repeat what I said at the beginning. Say a prayer for Joe Biden. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was great. Wanted to follow up with a couple of points that you made during your remarks. You've mentioned that we've entered into a very turbulent time politically. This has been building now for several years, and it seems to be a sort of confluence of a lot of different factors that are playing out in US politics and to some extent abroad as well. And these include things like climate change, and they include things like unfinished work of the civil rights movement, and they include things like industrial decline and the shift to a new economy or lack thereof. At this particular juncture, given what you've said, Colin, what should we be thinking about as our ask, and what's our give at the moment?
What we want and what is vital for us is access to the American market. And from that, everything else sort of follows. What the Americans want from us is a reliable ally. And I think that that's been the traditional compromise. This goes back to really the beginning of modern Canada-U.S. relations. That was set in place by Franklin Roosevelt, who I think was the president that best understood Canada. Remember, he used to summer in Canada, Campobello, and it's where he caught polio. And Mackenzie King, who I think realized that as the World War II was approaching, that in Britain may not be as reliable the pillar as it had been really from 1867 on. We had to have a relationship with the United States because you go back in Mackenzie King's heritage, his grandfather had been around when the Americans had not that long after we'd had fought the War of 1812, 1814 with the United States. So for his generation, there was still this threat that the United States had only recently become a friend. And what he set out to do and succeeded was to make the United States an ally. And what the basically the compromise that he and Franklin Roosevelt reached was access for Canada to the U.S. market, something we had tried to do since even before Confederation. We had a reciprocity trade agreement from 1854 to 1866, but it exploded with the Civil War when the Brits were seen to back the South rather than the North. And then MacDonald tried but failed and came up with a national policy. And then we made subsequent efforts. Laurier in 1911, Mackenzie King was offered it by Roosevelt 1945, but I think he looked in his crystal ball and said, no, it's too big a leap politically. And it took Brian Mulroney to do this, another 40 years later. So the trade-off for us has always been be a reliable ally. In return, we get access to the U.S. market. And what the U.S. is going to push us on now, and this will hold true of Biden just as it did for Trump, will be to do more up in the North where they are concerned what's going on, and in particular, the North Warning System and modernization of NORAD. That's going to be expensive, but it will allow us to reach a larger goal, and that's to the NATO target of spending 2% of GDP on defense, something we did just as a matter of course for many, many, many years. But in the dividends from the Cold War, we dropped down to a little less than 1%, and today we're about 1.1%.
So following up on that then, and on what you said, I think a lot of people who look at the United States today from the outside, as Canadians often do, and people around the world still do, there's a sense that America is a nation beset, preoccupied with its own problems, and that is maybe nowhere better exhibited than in the snowstorm last month in Texas, where conditions were evident in the media that made the United States look like a developing country. In the midst of all this, what's the big idea? What is it that the United States can champion, and that we can join with them in championing?
Well, the big idea to me is kind of a restoration of democracy, and I think Biden implicitly gets this, and I think Trudeau, and I do think this is something that goes across the political spectrum, because I do think the big challenge today is between open systems and closed systems. And so when Biden talks about a league of democracies, somehow democracy has to get its mojo back, because I think democracy is also the best way to provide for a sharing of the wealth. I think we also got away from that in the last 20 years with the sort of embrace of freer trade and the triumph of the market and things. But it's not what democracy, you go back to the Greek, it was sort of built upon. And so I think that, I talked about Lincoln. I do think that's something that we have to get back to in democracies. And I do think that Biden is absolutely right when he says the best antidote to populism, which is really the road to authoritarianism, is a reform and revitalization of democratic institutions and a more equitable sharing of the wealth. That it's not socialism, but it is what we enjoyed during what many people saw as that golden period of American and Western history, from really the Second World War to really about the late 70s, when the oil shocks began to change things. And it was things like the GI Bill. There was a kind of a citizens were much more engaged. Our voting was much higher, and people felt that the government was there to defend them. I remember Ronald Reagan says government's the problem. Bill Clinton says smaller government. But I think we've learned in the last few years that, particularly around COVID, that government's essential.
Yeah, yeah, certainly. And much has been made of the difference between the Trump and Biden administration's approaches in their efforts to curtail the coronavirus pandemic. How much of the change in administration has affected the approach to combating the coronavirus pandemic here in Canada? Do you think that we are going to benefit in any way from what the Biden administration has done, or do you think they'll continue to be preoccupied with combating the pandemic domestically?
Well, I think Biden politically first has to get the COVID under control. This is the test for him. Remember, he's facing an election in 2 years. As I pointed out earlier, the margins in the House and the Senate. In the Senate, it's 50-50. In the House, the Democrats lost seats in the last election. To succeed, he has to win and hold the Senate and the House in the next election. And he will be judged by the voters on how he deals first with the COVID crisis, and of course, inextricably linked to that is where are we in terms of the economy? And the economy means a restoration of jobs. From a Canadian perspective, we've got to hope and pray that he succeeds, because our own economy is so, again, I tried to point out, so linked to that of the United States. American recovery means Canadian recovery. If Americans aren't buying, then we're not selling. And then despite our best efforts to diversify, which is something I strongly believe in, but still the easiest market for this government's putting, I think, rightly emphasis on those small and medium-sized enterprises, women, Indigenous groups, others to get involved. The easiest market, we've done polling on this, tells us for them to get involved, to access, is still the United States.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, just as sort of, box score, what would you give Biden in his first, well, we're coming up on 2 months in office?
Well, I look at the opinion polls, and he's enjoying a favorability over 50%. I look at Real Clear Politics every day to just sort of see where things are at, and he is where he wants to be, but now he has to deliver on this, what I would call getting it done. He's got the same problem that we have in Canada-U.S. relations. He has to get it done. The rhetoric is there, although he's not Olympian like Obama, but he is a gifted legislator. When I met him, he was chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and when I met him, this would be 2004. Well, he'd been elected in 1973 as a senator, so he's very experienced. He is very much a creature of the U.S. Senate, where he served for 30 plus years before serving as vice president for 8 years.
Yeah, so an old hand.
Old hand, and also a people person. When I worked Capitol Hill, and I used to say there were two types of politicians. There's the talkers, and then there's the listeners. And the talkers outnumber the listeners about 9 to 1. Biden's a talker. When I first met him, I mentioned that my grandmother was born in Scranton. Well, he just took right off then. Oh, what was she doing, this and that? When I saw him thereafter, and I didn't see him very often because he's a busy guy, but these were often informal things, because I would go up and just try and see people, because it was very tough to get access. He was always engaged and engaging. He likes people. You see this comes through, and I think that's important. Barack Obama, by comparison, was a listener. I knew where the senator smoked. He was quite famous already, but then he'd given his great speech. And I would go up to him, I'd make my pitch, he'd listen, nod, and go away. The only time I ever got him to talk was when I talked about an environmental issue. And he said, he sort of piped up and said, I'd been a state senator in Illinois, and he'd put through legislation which prevented water from being pulled from the Great Lakes down to California. And they got talking, and I could see in his eyes, this guy was green. I always wish Stephen Harper had read that dispatch back, because remember, we made a big deal of Keystone, and it just didn't work out for us. We made it the litmus test of the relationship. Big mistake. Never make litmus tests with the Americans, because first of all, they don't think that much of us. But if we go in with a big demand that ain't going to go anywhere, nothing happens. And our relationship is so complex that we really have to be pushing in all fronts at all times, and don't make any one big project the end all to be all. I would, with the exception of say that the Canada-U.S. the renegotiation of the trade agreement, that involved everything, but still we were working on other fronts, including the environment, including on defense at the same time.
Do you think later this year we're going to see some domestic vaccine production in Canada? Do you think we're going to get American assistance with that? Do you think in the interim, the new administration is in any position to facilitate the export of US-made vaccines to Canada?
I don't think that's, well, to back up, yes, I think we're going to see the restoration of domestic vaccine production in Canada. I think they're talking about doing it just outside of Montreal, where we used to, we tried to make pharmaceuticals, but the natural market forces meant that just didn't work and stuff pulled away. And we made a mistake, as other countries did as well. I think we've learned through the pandemic that resiliency, particularly when it comes to health, is really, really important. And when it comes down to pandemics and things, borders will close. So you have to have domestic capacity. This is going to be as important as maintaining a military. And so I think we do that for our own purposes. Will the U.S. be helpful? Well, we may get some U.S. investment. I would think one thing we do really well in Canada is we do clinical trials. They often use Canada as a kind of test bed for new drugs because we're a good demographic portrait of the United States, with a couple of exceptions. They've got more Latinos, we have more Asians, but you can do a portrait. And because of our big university hospitals, and because of I think our national health system does help things. Americans do clinical trials up here. So I think that you can make a business case as to why you might want to do this. The relationship between our CDC in Winnipeg and the Atlanta CDC, that there's a lot of things that we have in common. And I do think that there's going to be much more emphasis now on health as a consequence of COVID in all governments. And yes, that will involve probably more collaboration.
Mm. So further, one of the questions that has been forwarded to me from a member of the audience is the shifting, or the potential for a shifting political landscape here in Canada. We've seen concerns raised over the We Charity scandal and the prorogation of Parliament last September. And they've led to whispers of a potential federal election following possibly later this year. Barring any sort of access to a crystal ball that you might have, how do you think a change in leadership in Canada is going to impact Canada-U.S. relations and efforts to work with the Biden administration?
Well, my presumption would be if there's a change in leadership, it's probably going to be a conservative leader. And my observation would be that the last great battle on how we approach the U.S. was the election of 1988 on free trade. And of course, it was ironic because the Liberals had been the free trade party until 1984, or almost 88, because even then I think Turner himself was somewhat conflicted, whereas the Tories had been traditionally the anti-free trade party. But once we fought that election, it's worth reminding ourselves that, well, Mulroney won the election. It's because of the vagaries of our system, and we sometimes criticize the American system, but he won with 40%. I'm glad he did. I was working on the free trade negotiations, but he only carried Alberta and Quebec, but he had enough of a majority in Parliament that he was able to get the free trade agreement through. And despite all the critics' concern that we were going to lose our sovereignty, in fact, we didn't. We became much richer as a consequence, and that allowed us to invest in the programs that I think make us Canadian, things like Medicare and education and the rest. So, but what it did, it brought that when Chrétien came to power in 1993, and this was really important, he set aside, as did Bill Clinton, the criticism of freer trade, and with the sleight of hand of a couple of environmental and labor accords, important in their own right, but not nearly as important as they were later to become, basically bought into free trade. But in terms of the overall relationship, my observation would be that the Conservatives are just as inclined to get along. They recognize, as Brian Mulroney did, that most important relationship any prime minister has is with the president of the United States. And so an Aaron O'Toole would be, as would Andrew Scheer, as would any other putative, as would Peter MacKay, any other conservative leader, I think would do the same. Not so sure about the NDP, but I also think the discipline of power, if they ever achieve power, would exert itself to change things. I certainly saw this with provincial premiers, and you see this with Mr. Horgan. I saw it certainly with Gary Doer, NDP premier from Manitoba, Daryl Dexter, the only NDP premier in Nova Scotia. They all recognized that their economies depended on their access to the United States. That's the great attitudinal shift I've seen since 1988. Whereas in 1988, 8 of the premiers opposed freer trade. Today, you wouldn't get a premier across Canada, socialist, separatist, liberal, or conservative, or NDP, who wouldn't favor closer relations, especially economic relations with the United States, because they recognize that's what generates revenue for their economies.
So I've had a further question from our audience as to what it is that Canada should be looking at in terms of its foreign policy beyond the United States, and how we might work both to advance our own interests, but also to dovetail with the agenda of the Biden administration. What maybe are sort of 3 areas that Canada should be looking at and working towards in terms of its broader foreign policy that might assist and at the same time promote our own interests?
Well, Kai, it comes down to me to basically just one, and that's what your institute's all about, and that's rules-based order, whether we're dealing it in a bilateral basis with the United States or multilateral. That's how Canada swings its weight internationally. And I think Canadians, because we are people of the world, our identity is in part of how we're seen abroad, because we are the people of the world. So I think the efforts that this government is making, as would a conservative government, and I think an NDP would do the same thing in terms of bolstering the multilateral system, because if multilateralism, which is really a new concept, really post-war, prior to that, it was concerts of power and spheres of influence. And in that world, which endured for centuries, it's big versus small, and we're middle power, but we get lumped into the small. And as Thucydides put it, the Peloponnesian history of the Peloponnesian War, when it's big versus small get dictated to. What we've created in kind of rules-based order, which is the greatest act of generosity and really an American idea of Franklin Roosevelt and then subsequent American presidents, all the way from Truman to Obama, not Trump, but Biden shares this, is create this multilateral system with rules-based order. That's where that's how we advance our interests, whether it doesn't matter what we're talking about, whether we're talking about climate, which is critically important today, or the economy. It's doing it in a rules-based system that we invest in, vital. But one thing I think we learned over the last 4 years, despite our best efforts, remember the Germans and the French created an alliance of multilateralism, but it wasn't enough to sustain the system. And the system is still on its back foot. It does need to be rebuilt. And so it's still an open question, and which is why this idea of the democracies coming together, I do think is really important. And I think anything we can do to contribute to that, as we're doing incrementally with the World Trade Organization through the Ottawa Group, as we're doing in the Lima Group to help out Venezuela, as we're going to probably be asked to do in Central America to be helpful. That's what we should be doing, because first of all, it wins us influence in Washington, and bluntly, in terms of Canadian place in the world, if we have access in Washington, then the rest of the world, which is always befuddled by what the Americans are doing, particularly when the Republican administration, they turn to us and ask us to interpret for them. My friends in Trudeau's office tell me that in the first year in office, he was reaching out, as he should, brand new leader. But the day that Trump was elected, the phone calls started coming the other way from London and Paris and Berlin, saying, explain to us what just happened, which leads me to another point. and which is something your institution is doing, but we don't do enough of in Canada. We're the best placed country in the world to understand the United States and help interpret that, but we don't put nearly the weight in that interpretive fashion at our universities and research centers on understanding the United States, which is critically important, particularly for fellow democracies. And the Chinese are also fascinated by what's going on in the United States. Conversations I have with the Chinese ambassador are as much about what's going on in the United States as they are about what's going on in Canada.
So just to one further question that I've received from our audience is, I'm wondering if you could give both a recap of some of the most pertinent and yet overlooked changes since Biden took office, and perhaps also provide a projection of how Canada's relationship with the States will look post lockdown and potentially post pandemic.
Well, I think the most significant change with Biden is what I call, and it's a phrase they use in Congress, return to regular order. The system works on order. Again, the Law Institute understands this, the rules-based system. And Biden is very much of that, and that is what he is restoring. And I think successfully. It may not be as exciting as Trump, but gosh, it certainly works a lot better. So that's pertinent and often overlooked. Where we'll be, well, we've got a roadmap, and again, full credit to Biden, who reached out because he wants to prove. And Canada's actually, this is important. We're the demonstration project for the rest of the alliance. He's sending off Blinken and I think a couple of other secretaries are heading off to Tokyo and probably Canberra this week, and he's had conversations with those in Berlin and Paris and London. But I think they chose. I'm told they chose us as kind of the closest, nearest ally, and probably the easiest one to come up with. Let's show the alliance that we truly mean business and that we are going to take them seriously. So this roadmap, and the roadmap was very much a Canadian creation. We came up with the headings, but then the Biden folks shrewdly and smartly filled in the gaps. So for example, when you get to bolstering security, which is, we included, in fact, that probably got pulled out to 2 bits there, the reference to the 2%, the commitment at the Wales Summit in 2014 to do more in defense spending, and the burden sharing, which is something every American president, including Trump, has made, is there. And that was inserted by the Americans. But the rest of it was basically our sort of agenda and smart work on our part. And I do think I give the Trudeau government credit for getting the one big thing they had to get right, and that was the U.S. relationship. Trudeau, remember, he remade his cabinet. He dispatched Dion off to Berlin, and he brought in Chrystia Freeland, who of his cabinet ministers proved as trade minister, she understood the relationship best. And Trudeau, despite the slapping around he got from Trump, did his best effort to create a relationship with Trump. It had been a bromance with Obama, but he did his best, and he's now doing his best with Biden. Took a risk early on by making the first call to congratulate him. Biden makes the first call back, and now we're enjoying the dividends. But now we have to deliver. Getting it done is really important because we've got this roadmap. It's up to us to actually keep the Americans on point because, as I pointed out, he's got so many challenges. First, all the domestic ones, and then the rest of the world. So for us to succeed, it really is up to us, but we are blessed with a roadmap and a commitment by an administration that wants it to succeed because of its demonstration effect to the rest of the alliance.
All right. Well, I wanted to take a moment to ask if there are any further questions in the audience. We've had a few. All right. Well, I wanted to invite Victoria Ostrovsky to say a few concluding words.
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, I would like to thank you on behalf of the Canada-U.S. Law Institute and Western University for taking the time to speak to us this afternoon about the relationship between the Canadian and U.S. governments and particularly the future of this relationship in light of both the new Biden administration and COVID-19. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Victoria. I just wanted to thank Colin on behalf of the Institute for some very insightful comments today. And normally at this point, you'd be receiving a few little presents from us. Those will be following in the mail. But in the meantime, we wanted to thank you and just to let you know that we'll continue to be watching your very insightful commentary in the media. Whenever there's a column by Colin Robertson, I'm sure to look it up, as I'm sure many people are, both here and elsewhere, as we continue to watch what's going on in our great southern neighbor. But thank you again, and thank you to everybody, all of our attendees, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.